The papers landed on the dining table with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than a gunshot. My father slid them toward me with the kind of casual confidence reserved for people who believed they'd already won. "We sold the land," he said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Your brother needed help getting back on his feet." I stared at the deed transfer forms, seeing my name crossed out in black ink. My grandmother's land, the 5 acres she'd promised me since I was 12, was gone. David sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with his arms folded, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He tapped his fingers on the table like he was keeping time to a song only he could hear. My mother stood by the kitchen doorway, wringing her hands but saying nothing. The room tilted slightly as the reality sank in. They'd already done it. This wasn't a discussion or a warning. It was an announcement. "This is what family does, Avery," my mother finally said, her voice thin and rehearsed. My name is Avery Dalton, and that was the moment I realized my family had never actually seen me as family. I stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My father cleared his throat, shifting in his seat like he was preparing to deliver a lecture. "Your brother made some bad investments," he explained, as if that justified everything. "He needed capital to recover. The land was just sitting there. Just sitting there. My grandmother's land. The place where she taught me to identify wildflowers and told me stories about her own childhood. The place she made me promise to protect." David's smirk widened. "You'll bounce back," he said casually. "You always do." Something cold settled in my chest. Not anger yet, just a deep, hollow realization. I'd spent 28 years trying to be the good daughter, the understanding sister, the one who sacrificed without complaint. And this was what had earned me. My mother took a step forward, her expression softening into what she probably thought was concern. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said quietly. But her eyes weren't red. She wasn't crying. She was simply waiting for me to accept it, like I always did. That night, they called a family meeting. I should have known better than to show up. They sat me down in the living room, my parents on the couch, David sprawling in the recliner like he owned the place. Which, in a way, he did. My father started first. "We need to talk about your reaction today," he said, his tone measured and parental. "Your mother and I made a difficult decision, and we need you to understand that it wasn't personal. Not personal. They'd sold my inheritance behind my back, forged my signature on documents I'd never seen, and handed everything to my brother. But it wasn't personal." My mother nodded along, adding, "We're a family, Avery. Families help each other. Your brother was in a crisis, and we did what we had to do." I noticed she kept saying "we" like it softened the blow. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Look, I get that you're upset," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But that land was dead weight anyway. I'm actually using it for something productive." I felt my hands clench in my lap. Every instinct screamed at me to explode, to yell, to make them see what they'd done. But instead, I stood up. Without a word, I walked to the front door. The silence behind me felt heavier than any argument. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept circling back through the years, piecing together a pattern I'd been too loyal to see. I remembered being 12, working on my science fair project for weeks. David had knocked it off the table in a fit of anger, destroying months of work. My mother had simply sighed and said, "He didn't mean it, sweetheart. You know how he gets." I remembered being 17, excited about the college fund my grandmother had set up for me. Then my parents sat me down and explained that David needed a fresh start after dropping out of his first university. The fund was gone. They promised they'd pay me back. They never did. I remembered being 20, working 2 jobs while going to community college part-time. David lived at home rent-free, sleeping until noon and complaining about how hard his life was. When I asked if he could contribute to household expenses, my mother had looked at me like I'd suggested something cruel. The pattern was clear now, glaring and undeniable. I'd been invisible my entire life, visible only when they needed me to step aside for David. I packed my car on a Tuesday morning while my parents were at work and David was still asleep. I moved quickly and quietly, taking only what was truly mine. Clothes, books, my laptop, a few photographs that didn't include any of them. I'd already found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, but it was affordable and, most importantly, it was mine. My mother came home just as I was loading the last box. She stood in the driveway with her arms crossed, her expression hovering between hurt and anger. "You're really doing this?" she asked. "You're going to throw a tantrum and abandon your family?" I didn't answer. I just closed the trunk and walked around to the driver's side. My father pulled up as I was getting in. He rolled down his window. "Avery, this is childish," he called out. "Come inside and let's talk like adults." David appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his usual smirk. "Don't be so dramatic," he said. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway without looking back. As I drove away, I saw my mother in the rearview mirror, still standing there with her arms crossed, watching me leave like I was the one who'd done something wrong. The apartment was quiet. Almost too quiet at first. I'd grown used to the constant noise of my parents' house. My mother's television shows, my father's phone calls, David's video games blaring at all hours. Here, there was only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of footsteps from the apartment above. I sat on my second-hand couch that first night, eating takeout straight from the container, and realized something surprising. I wasn't sad. I was relieved. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was about to ask me to give up something else. No one was going to barge into my space and demand my time, my money, or my understanding. I started building a routine. I focused on my job at the accounting firm, picked up freelance work on weekends, and began actually saving money instead of watching it disappear into my family's endless needs. Every morning, I woke up without the familiar knot of tension in my chest. Every evening, I came home to peace. Slowly, I started to remember who I was before I became the family's designated doormat. 2 months after I moved out, my Aunt Rachel called. She was my mother's younger sister, and we'd always had a decent relationship, though she usually stayed out of family drama. "Honey," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "I need to tell you something, but you can't say it came from me." I sat up straighter on my couch. "What's going on?" There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, working up the courage to speak. "Something's happening with your parents' finances," she finally said. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard your mother on the phone last week. She was crying, talking about not being able to make payments on something." My stomach tightened. "Payments on what?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "But Avery, I think they're in deep trouble. Your father's been asking relatives for loans. Your mother stopped coming to our book club. I haven't seen your brother's car there in weeks, and when I asked about him, your mother changed the subject immediately." After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them deal with their own problems for once. But another part, the part that still remembered being their daughter before everything fell apart, needed to know the truth. I didn't break any laws. I didn't hire a private investigator or hack into their accounts. I simply paid attention to things that were publicly available. County records. Court filings. Property tax information. Things anyone could look up if they knew where to search. It took me 3 days of careful research, cross-referencing addresses and names, following paper trails that led from one document to another. And then I found it. A foreclosure notice filed against my parents' home. The house where I'd grown up, where my mother had hosted countless holiday dinners, where my father had built a workshop in the garage. The house they'd always treated like their greatest achievement was about to be taken away. I stared at the screen, reading the legal language over and over, making sure I understood correctly. They'd missed 4 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had issued multiple warnings. The property was scheduled for auction. I scrolled down to see the timeline. The notice had been filed 6 weeks ago. They'd had plenty of chances to fix this, to reach out, to ask for help. Instead, they'd stayed silent, probably hoping the problem would somehow disappear. I saved the document and closed my laptop, my hands trembling slightly. I couldn't let it go. Over the next week, I dug deeper into public records, piecing together a financial history that made my stomach turn. They'd refinanced the house 3 times in the last 5 years. Each time, they'd pulled out equity, and each time, the mortgage payment had increased. I found records of personal loans, credit card judgments, and small claims court cases. Every trail led back to the same source, David. There were records of a failed business venture he'd started 2 years ago, a tech startup that burned through investor money and collapsed within 8 months. My parents had co-signed on the business loan. There were credit card bills in my father's name with charges at expensive restaurants and luxury hotels, always around the dates when David had been networking for his various schemes. The most painful discovery was a loan document from 4 years ago. The amount matched exactly what had been in my college fund. I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by printed documents, feeling sick. My inheritance wasn't the first thing they'd sacrificed for David. It was just the last thing they thought I'd notice. And now their generosity had bankrupted them. The auction date jumped out at me from the foreclosure notice like a neon sign, 34 days from today. 34 days until my childhood home would be sold to the highest bidder. I imagined strangers walking through the rooms where I'd learned to ride a bike in the hallway, where my grandmother had taught me to bake in the kitchen. I thought about some investor buying it, flipping it, erasing every memory the walls held. Then I thought about my parents. How they'd given David everything and expected me to smile and accept it. How they'd sold my inheritance without hesitation but were somehow shocked that actions had consequences. Something shifted inside me. Not rage, that would have been too hot, too chaotic. This was something colder, clearer. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to hurt them or humiliate them. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted control over my own story. And I wanted them to finally understand that their choices mattered. I opened my laptop and began researching auction procedures, mortgage calculations, and property values. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. I needed to be absolutely prepared. I spent the next 2 weeks planning with the kind of focus I'd never applied to anything before. I contacted my bank and spoke with a loan officer about pre-approval. I met with a real estate attorney to understand the auction process and potential complications. I calculated and recalculated my finances, making sure I could actually afford to follow through. The numbers were tight, but possible. I'd been saving aggressively since moving out, and I had a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never touched. Combined with a loan, I could make a competitive bid. Every night, I spread financial documents across my coffee table and worked through different scenarios. What if the bidding went higher than expected? What if there were legal complications? What if my parents somehow found out beforehand? I prepared for every possibility I could imagine. My coworkers noticed the change in me. "You seem different lately," my colleague Jennifer said during lunch one day. "More focused or something?" I smiled. "Just working on a project," I said. She didn't need to know that the project was buying my parents' house out from under them. That knowledge was mine alone, a secret that gave me strength every time I doubted myself. The pre-approval letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I held it in my hands, staring at the official bank letterhead, the typed amount that represented years of careful saving and hard work. This was real money, earned through late nights and weekend shifts, through saying no to vacations and impulse purchases. Every dollar represented a choice I'd made to invest in my own future instead of waiting for my family to value me. I thought about David, who'd never held a job for more than 18 months, who'd blown through money like it was confetti at a parade. I thought about my parents, who'd enabled him at every turn, who'd taught him that consequences were optional if you had the right people protecting you. The difference between us wasn't talent or opportunity. It was discipline. It was understanding that money represented time and effort, not just numbers in an account. I'd learned to manage finances by watching my parents mismanage theirs. I'd learned to save by watching David spend. In a strange way, they'd taught me everything I needed to know, just not in the way they'd intended. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my growing file of documents. 22 days until the auction. I started driving past the house occasionally, usually in the evening when the streetlights cast long shadows across the lawn. I didn't park or approach. I just drove by slowly, observing. Some nights, the house was dark except for the flickering blue glow of a television in the living room. Other nights, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, hear raised voices even from the street. David's car wasn't there as often anymore. When it was, it never stayed long. Usually just long enough for him to load boxes into the trunk or argue with someone on his phone while pacing the driveway. I wondered if he knew about the foreclosure. I wondered if he cared. One evening, I saw my mother standing at the kitchen window, staring out at nothing. Even from a distance, I could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to protect herself from an invisible weight. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. But then I remembered her voice saying, "This is what family does," while defending the theft of my inheritance. I drove away, my resolve hardening with each passing mile back to my quiet apartment. I ran into my mother at the grocery store on a Saturday morning. I was in the produce section, comparing apples, when I looked up and saw her pushing a cart toward me. Her eyes met mine for just a second before she quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in a display of oranges. I could have let her pretend she hadn't seen me. Instead, I said her name. "Mom." She stopped, her fingers tightening on the cart handle. Slowly, she turned and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Avery." "Hello." We stood there in the fluorescent lighting, surrounded by the mundane sounds of grocery shopping, beeping scanners, shopping cart wheels, soft music playing overhead. "How's life?" she asked, her voice strained. "Stable," I replied. The word landed between us like a stone. I watched something flicker across her face, surprise, maybe, or discomfort. She'd expected me to struggle without them, to come crawling back admitting I couldn't survive alone. My stability was an accusation she hadn't prepared for. "That's good," she said finally, though her tone suggested it wasn't good at all. "We've been busy with various things." She trailed off, and I didn't fill the silence. After another awkward moment, she muttered something about needing to finish shopping and hurried away, her cartwheel squeaking slightly. A week before the auction, I got a message from an old neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd lived 3 houses down from my parents for 20 years. "Avery, I don't know if you know, but your parents have been packing boxes. I've seen a moving truck in the driveway twice this week. Is everything okay?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. So it was really happening. They were losing the house, and they hadn't told me. Not that I expected them to, we'd barely spoken since I moved out. But still, the confirmation made everything feel suddenly more real and more urgent. I typed back a simple reply, "Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate you checking in." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining my parents boxing up 25 years of memories, probably still not understanding how they'd ended up here. Did they blame David? Did they blame themselves? Or did they somehow still blame me for not being understanding enough, for not sacrificing more? The auction was in 6 days. I checked my bank accounts one more time, confirmed my loan documents were in order, and set 3 different alarms for auction morning. This was happening. One way or another, this was really happening. The county auction room smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. Metal folding chairs faced a podium where an auctioneer was setting up a microphone and shuffling through property listings. I arrived 30 minutes early and chose a seat in the middle of the room, not too eager in the front, not too hidden in the back. Around me, people chatted casually about properties and investment opportunities. To them, this was just business. To me, it was the culmination of 28 years of being invisible. The room filled slowly. I recognized a few faces. Local real estate investors I'd researched, a couple who flipped houses in the area. No one from my family was there. Of course not. They probably couldn't bear to watch. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the microphone as he started the proceedings. Property numbers flashed on a screen behind him. I watched several houses sell, my heart rate increasing with each gavel strike. And then it appeared, my parents' address. The auctioneer rattled off the details. Square footage, lot size, outstanding mortgage amount. He started the bidding at 60% of the assessed value. A paddle went up in the front row. Then another. I waited, watching the numbers climb, calculating in my head. At the right moment, I raised my paddle. Calm. Composed. Exactly as I'd practiced. The bidding continued. Each time someone raised their paddle, I countered quickly and confidently. The auctioneer's voice became a rhythm. 75,000, do I hear 80? 80 in the back, do I hear 85? I kept my face neutral, showing no emotion as the price climbed. Some bidders dropped out early. Others stayed in longer, but I could see them hesitating, calculating whether the property was worth the increasing price. I'd done my homework. I knew exactly how high I could go, and I'd prepared myself to go there if necessary. At 92,000, only one other bidder remained. A man in a suit who looked like he bought properties the way normal people bought groceries. When I countered his bid at 95,000, he paused for a long moment, studying his paperwork. The auctioneer called out, 95,000, going once, going twice. The man in the suit shook his head and lowered his paddle. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the whole room. Sold to bidder number 43. The house was mine. I sat perfectly still, my paddle resting in my lap, while the auctioneer moved on to the next property. Around me, people were already standing, stretching, talking about their wins and losses. But I couldn't move yet. I just stared at the screen where my parents' address still glowed, my name now attached to it. I sat in my car in the parking lot, the deed paperwork resting on the passenger seat. My childhood address was printed at the top, and below it, my name as the new owner. The morning sun streamed through the windshield, making the official stamps and signatures look almost surreal. I'd done it. The house where I'd lost my first tooth, where I'd gotten ready for prom, where I'd sat at the kitchen table doing homework while my mother cooked dinner, it was mine now. Not through inheritance or family generosity, but through my own planning and sacrifice. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. It was more like I'd completed something necessary, like setting a broken bone. It hurt, but it was the hurt of healing, not injury. My phone buzzed. A text from the auction company confirming my winning bid and outlining the next steps for finalizing the purchase. Another text from my bank acknowledging the pending transaction. Everything was moving forward with bureaucratic efficiency. I started the car and drove back to my apartment, the deed carefully tucked into my bag. I had 30 days before the sale would be final, 30 days before I'd have to face my parents with this truth. For now, I'd let them wonder who bought their house. Let them imagine it was some faceless investor who'd turned their memories into profit. The truth would be so much harder to process. 3 days after the auction, my father called. I stared at his name on my phone screen, watching it ring once, twice, 3 times. He never called me. Even before everything fell apart, he'd always made my mother handle family communications. I answered on the 4th ring. Hello? Avery. His voice was strained, formal. We need to talk. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, he continued. The house situation has become complicated. Your mother is very upset. I almost laughed at the understatement. I'm sorry to hear that, I said carefully. We don't know who bought it at auction, he said, and I could hear frustration bleeding into his tone. The county clerk said it's all confidential until the sale is final. But we need to figure out what we're doing, where we're going. He paused, and I heard him take a breath. Your mother suggested we might call you. To let you know what's happening. I already know what's happening, I said quietly. Do you? His tone sharpened. Because I don't think you understand how serious this is. We're losing our home, Avery. The home where we raised you and your brother. The home you mortgaged repeatedly to bail out David, I thought. But I didn't say it. Instead, I said, actually, Dad, I know exactly who bought the house. The silence that followed was deafening. I drove to the house the next morning. My parents were expecting me. I'd texted my father the address as if he didn't already know it, as if I was just visiting rather than arriving as the new owner. My mother's car was in the driveway next to my father's truck. David's car was nowhere to be seen. Of course not. He'd probably stopped showing up once he realized there was nothing left to take. I walked up to the front porch, the deed folded in my jacket pocket. I didn't knock. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking at the door where I'd stood countless times before, coming home from school, leaving for dates, returning from college visits that I'd ultimately couldn't afford. The door opened before I could decide whether to ring the bell. My mother stood there, and I barely recognized her. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 2 months since I'd moved out. Her hair was uncombed, her clothes wrinkled. Avery, she said, her voice cracking slightly. My father appeared behind her, his expression guarded. David wasn't there, but I could see his presence in the boxes stacked in the hallway, in the empty spaces on walls where pictures used to hang. I pulled out the deed and held it up so they could see the official county seal. My mother's eyes focused on it, confusion flickering across her face as she tried to read the text from a distance. Then understanding dawned, and her knees actually buckled. My father caught her arm, his face going pale. No, he said. No, you didn't. You bought our house? My father's voice rose with each word. You bought our house at auction? I stayed calm. I'd practiced this moment in my head 100 times, rehearsed staying composed no matter how they reacted. Yes, I said simply. My mother made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She grabbed the doorframe for support, staring at me like I'd become someone she didn't recognize. Maybe I had. How could you do this to us? My father demanded. He stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Your own parents? You let us lose our home when you could have helped us? The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Like you helped me? I asked quietly. When you sold my inheritance to David? That was different, my mother cried. Your brother needed help. He was in crisis. And you're not in crisis now? I countered. You're losing your house because you kept bailing him out, kept refinancing to cover his failures. When does it end? My father's jaw tightened. You're being cruel, Avery. This isn't like you. Maybe you never really knew me, I replied. The words from those viral stories I'd read echoed in my mind. Maybe I was always capable of protecting myself. I just needed a reason. My mother began crying in earnest now, but I noticed my father's expression had shifted from anger to something else. Calculation. What do you want? My father asked, his voice dropping to a more measured tone. He'd switched tactics, trying to negotiate now that anger hadn't worked. You clearly bought the house for a reason. What's your plan here? I looked at both of them, my mother still crying, my father trying to regain control of a situation that was entirely out of his hands. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. You can stay, I said calmly. If you want to. But you'll rent from me at market rate. I've already researched comparable properties in the area. $1,500 a month, first and last month's rent up front, standard lease agreement. My mother's crying stopped abruptly. Rent, she repeated, her voice hollow. From our own daughter? It's a fair price, I continued. Actually, it's slightly below market rate for a house this size. But those are my terms. You can accept them, or you can make other arrangements. My father's face turned red again. This is blackmail. This is extortion. No, it's property ownership, I corrected. I bought this house legally at a public auction. Now I'm offering you a rental agreement. That's more than you offered me when you sold my land. That land was different, my mother insisted, finding her voice. Your brother was desperate. We had to help him. Where is David? I asked, looking around pointedly. Where is he now that you're the ones who need help? The question hung in the air like smoke. Your brother has his own problems right now, my father said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. He can't be expected to what? I interrupted. To help the parents who sacrificed everything for him? To show up when they're in crisis? Interesting. My mother wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. He's been dealing with his own financial difficulties. His business ventures haven't worked out as planned. They never do, I said. And yet you keep funding them, keep bailing him out, keep expecting me to understand. I pulled out a printed lease agreement from my bag. I need an answer. These are the terms. You have until the end of the week to decide. My father glanced at the papers but didn't take them. And if we refuse? Then I'll find other tenants, I said simply. This is a good property in a decent neighborhood. It won't stay empty long. I set the lease agreement on the small table by the door. I'm not trying to punish you, I added, and I meant it. I'm just not protecting you from consequences anymore. That's what you taught me, right? That family helps each other? Well, I'm helping by giving you an option to stay in your home. But I'm not saving you from the results of your own choices. I turned to leave, then paused. David's welcome to contribute to the rent if he wants. If he even bothers to call you back. I walked to my car without looking back. The call came 4 days later. My father's voice was subdued, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. We'll sign the lease, he said. We don't have many other options. I'll email you the documents, I replied, keeping my tone professional. First month's rent is due on the 1st of next month. There was a long pause. Then, quietly, my father said, David moved in with some friends in another state. He said he needed a fresh start away from all the negativity. By negativity, he probably meant responsibility. My mother called an hour later. Your brother thinks we're being too hard on him, she said, her voice small and fragile. He said we were pressuring him too much about money. I didn't respond immediately. What could I say? That I'd warned them? That I'd watched this pattern for years? Mom, I finally said, do you understand now? Do you see what I've been trying to tell you? She was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he was supposed to be different. We thought if we just helped him enough, supported him enough. You taught him that actions don't have consequences, I said gently. You taught him that someone would always fix his problems. And now he's gone, and you're the ones paying the price. The lease was signed the next day. 6 months later, I stood in my house, because that's what it was now, truly mine, and looked around at the changes I'd made. Fresh paint in warm, welcoming colors. Refinished hardwood floors. New kitchen cabinets. The bones of my childhood home remained, but I'd transformed it into something that reflected who I was now, not who I'd been expected to be. My parents had moved to a smaller rental across town after 3 months. They couldn't afford to stay, not without David contributing or changing their spending habits. We saw each other occasionally. The conversations were polite but shallow, the kind of careful exchanges between acquaintances rather than family. But there was peace in that distance, a clarity that hadn't existed before. I'd kept some of their furniture, the pieces that held actual memories rather than just space. My grandmother's rocking chair sat by the window where she used to read to me. The kitchen table where we'd had family dinners before everything got complicated. But everything else was new, chosen by me, paid for by me. I hosted a small housewarming party, inviting friends from work and my Aunt Rachel. As we stood in the living room, Rachel raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said. I smiled, touching my glass to hers. "To closure," I replied. Because that's what this really was. Not revenge, though I knew how it looked from the outside. It was closure. It was taking back the power I'd given away for too many years. It was proving to myself that I could stand on my own, make my own choices, and live with the consequences. The house that once represented everything wrong with my family now represented everything right about my independence. I'd bought it at auction with money I'd earned and saved. I'd renovated it with my own vision. I'd transformed it from a symbol of their mistakes into a symbol of my strength. My phone buzzed with a text from David, the first in months. "Heard you're doing well. Maybe we can catch up sometime?" I looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. I walked through my house one more time that evening, touching the walls, feeling the solidity of it beneath my fingers. This was mine. Not through inheritance or family generosity, but through my own intelligence, planning, and strength. And that made all the difference.